Okay, picture this. It's the 19th century, and India is fighting two massive wars at the exact same time. One is the one we all know about, the fight against the British Empire for freedom, but the other? The other was a war against itself, a deep, intense battle for its own soul. This is the story of how a modern nation was forged in the fire of that double conflict.
And it really makes you ask a fundamental question, doesn't it? How is a nation actually born? Is it just about fighting off foreign rulers? Or is it about that much harder, much messier internal struggle to reform and redefine your own society? For 19th century India, the answer wasn't A or B. It was a chaotic, brilliant, and often brutal both.
You see, this period wasn't about a single, simple awakening. Think of it more like two powerful rivers of change, running side by side. One was a war of ideas, fought in lecture halls and on the pages of newspapers. The other was a raw war for survival, fought in forests and on farmlands. And both were absolutely essential in shaping the India that we know today.
So let's start in the cities, because here, a new, educated Indian class was grappling with these enormous society-shaking questions. Faced with Western science, Western ideas, and Western power, they started to ask, what do we need to change about ourselves, and what parts of our identity must we preserve no matter what? This wasn't just some polite debate. It was an all-out intellectual war for the nation's soul.
And pretty quickly, this intellectual battle split into two main camps, creating this deep and fascinating tension that would define the era. On one side, you had people who believed India needed radical reform from within. And on the other, you had those who said, no, the answer is to revive a glorious golden past.
I mean, this was a fundamental clash of visions for the future. The reformists, they were looking at Western ideas of reason and human rights, and they wanted to use them to tear down what they saw as oppressive social customs. But the revivalists, they often saw the West as the source of the problem. For them, the answer wasn't to look outward, but to look inward, to return to the perceived purity of ancient tradition.
And these were not just abstract theories. They sparked real, powerful movements that changed society. You had the Brahmo Samaj, for example, fighting to abolish sati, the horrific practice of a widow being burned alive on her husband's funeral pyre. Then, on the revivalist side, you had the Arya Samaj with its powerful call to return to the Vedas. And then you had the really radical groups like the Satyashodak Samaj, which launched the direct attack on the caste system itself. This was a message of equality that would echo for generations.
And this wasn't just happening within the Hindu community. Not at all. Across the Muslim community, you had the exact same kinds of fiery debates. The oligarch movement argued that modern, Western education was the only way forward. Meanwhile, the Deoband movement stressed religious tradition and orthodoxy. Literally every corner of Indian society was going through this profound, intense period of self-examination.
And out of all this churning of old ideas and new, some incredibly powerful philosophies started to pop up, things that would totally reshape what religion meant in a modern India. Swami Vivekananda's message, summed up perfectly in this quote, was a total game changer. It basically reframed spiritual duty. It wasn't just about your own personal salvation anymore. It was a patriotic call to lift up the entire nation through social service.
But right at the very heart of this huge ideological war was one single explosive issue: the status of women. For the reformers, this wasn't just one issue among many. To them, the emancipation of women was the ultimate test. It was the yardstick by which you could measure whether a society was truly modern and civilized.
And just look at this timeline. It tells the story of a battle that lasted for 100 years. It really kicks off with campaigns like the one led by Raja Ram Mohan Roy, which finally led to the British banning sati in 1829. And then, in a move that was just unbelievably revolutionary for its time, Savitribai Phule opened the first ever school for girls in 1848, shattering centuries of tradition that had locked women out of education.
And then came this incredible moment, 1856. After a relentless, passionate, and brilliant campaign by the great reformer Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, a law was passed that allowed Hindu widows to remarry. I mean, this was a seismic shift. It was a direct punch to the gut of centuries of dogma, and it was real, tangible proof that organized reform could actually change the law and change people's lives.
Okay, so while all these intellectual battles were reshaping the cities, a totally different kind of war was breaking out in the countryside. This wasn't a war of ideas. This was a raw, physical, desperate struggle for land, for rights, and for sheer survival. Just look at this map for a second. It tells a story not of polite debate, but of pure desperation and defiance.
From the Santhal Rebellion to the Munda Uprising, huge parts of the country were literally up in flames with revolts. We're not talking about some small, fringe activity here. This was widespread, mass resistance against a system that was absolutely crushing them.
So what was going on? What was driving all this rebellion? Well, the British had systematically taken apart the traditional way of life. They brought in these crushing new tax systems, they stripped communities of the rights to their ancestral lands, and they basically let loose a new class of predatory moneylenders and traders. For millions of people, it was a slow-motion disaster. And make no mistake, these were not just riots. These were organized wars of liberation, and they had names that still echo with defiance today. Take the Ulgulan, which means the Great Tumult. This was the revolt led by the charismatic Birsa Munda, and it was an all-out war to take back not just their land, but their dignity, their culture, and their very right to rule themselves. And it is so important to understand that this resistance wasn't just limited to tribal communities. Peasants all across the country were also rising up. The Indigo Revolt of 1859 in Bengal is a perfect example. You had farmers who were being forced to grow indigo for British planters under these insanely exploitative conditions, and they just finally said, no more. So, for a long time in the 19th century, you had these two great rivers of change, the intellectual debates in the city and the raw rebellions in the countryside, and they were flowing in separate channels. But as a new century began, something amazing started to happen. They began to merge, creating this political tidal wave that would eventually help sweep an entire empire away. So how did this happen? Well, you can think of it in a few steps. First, you had those separate struggles we talked about. But then, new organizations started to form, things like peasant unions or Kisan Sabhas. And they started building bridges, connecting the desperate fight for land in the villages to the political debates happening in the cities. And that, finally, led to a truly national vision, one where social justice and economic rights were seen as completely inseparable from the dream of a free India.
This right here, this was the crucial chemical reaction. All those abstract ideas from the urban reformers, ideas about rights, justice, equality, they gave a new, powerful language to all that anger that was simmering out in the countryside. Suddenly, a peasant's fight against a greedy landlord wasn't just a personal problem anymore. Now it could be framed as a battle for justice.
I mean, just look at this specific demand from the Tabaga movement in Bengal. This is not the chaotic rage of a mob. This is a clear, calculated political demand. We want the landlord share reduced from 1/2 of the crop to 1/3. See the difference? This is the language of an organized, ideologically savvy movement that had learned how to combine the fight for survival with a demand for economic justice.
So you see, the freedom struggle was never just about getting rid of a foreign power. It was about forging a new kind of India, a nation born from two incredible battles, one for the soul of its society and one for the rights of its most vulnerable people. And that leaves us with one last, really crucial question. Here in the 21st century, which of those battles for social justice, for equality, and for dignity are we still fighting today?